Tonight's presenter, Jeffrey Von Arx, S.J., is the Thomas I. Gasson, S.J. Professor for 2018-2019. Funded by a generous gift from the Jesuit community at Boston College, and that's the St. Mary's Jesuit community, the Gasson Chair is the oldest endowed professorship at Boston College and is held by a distinguished Jesuit scholar in any discipline. We are pleased that Father Von Arx is affiliated with the School of Theology and Ministry this year in his role as Gasson Professor. A graduate of Princeton and Yale, as well as the Weston Jesuit School of Theology, Father Von Arx began his academic career at Georgetown University and taught history there for 16 years. During his tenure there, he served as chair of the history department and was the founding director of Georgetown's Center for Australian and New Zealand Studies. Father Von Arx later served as dean of Fordham College at Rose Hill, and in 2004 was elected president of Fairfield University, serving in that role until 2017. Father Von Arx is a historian who has written or taught in the areas of British and Irish history, Australian history, church history, and historiography. In 1999, he was elected a Fellow of the Royal Historical Society, and he is the author of the book Progress and Pessimism, Religion, Politics, and History in Late 19th Century Britain, and is the editor and contributor to a volume called Varieties to Ultramontanism. Father Von Arx is currently the superior and director of John Lafarge House in Cambridge, an independent Jesuit community and house of studies for Jesuits doing graduate work in the Boston area. As Gasson Professor, Father Von Arx will teach a course for us this spring, and I'm going off script here, but I can honestly say 2 nights ago, one of the Jesuit scholastics was advising a fellow scholastic about the course and said, that's the best course I took at BCSTM last year. So he's teaching a course in history for us and will also offer another public lecture in February. He's currently working on a book project on Cardinal Henry Edward Manning, who is featured in this evening's presentation. Please join me in welcoming a distinguished Jesuit University administrator and scholar, Father Jeffrey Von Arx, whose lecture is titled Two Cardinals, Conflict and Controversy in the Victorian Catholic Church.
That was good. Just the right way. I told him to keep it short, so that was pretty good. Hello, everyone. It's great to be here. I'm really very grateful to the School of Theology and Ministry and to the Boston College Jesuit community and to the Jesuit Institute for offering me this wonderful opportunity to be here at BC as Gasson Professor this year. It was a real treat and something that I didn't think I quite deserved, but I was very happy to accept it. I want to assure you, first of all, that I appreciate the irony of my position tonight. I'm going to be speaking to you a fair amount about John Henry Newman, on the left. I'm not a Newman expert. My only real claim to speak about him is a certain familiarity with Newman's contemporary and nemesis, the other great Victorian convert cardinal, Henry Edward Manning, on the right, who was Archbishop of Westminster and head of the English Roman Catholic Church from 1865 to 1892, and about whom I'm currently writing a book. I like to think that John Henry would appreciate the irony. I'm not so sure about Henry Edward. Irony was not his métier, as you can tell by looking at him, right? The irony of my position is more even than you would be likely to know. If there was any individual or group whom Manning disliked as much, if not more than Newman, it was the religious order to which I have the honor of belonging. To have his side of the conflict with Newman presented by a Jesuit is an irony that even old Manning would have appreciated. I also appreciate the delicacy of my position. Most of you, I imagine, are fairly well acquainted with Newman's life. At least I'll be presuming that you are in what follows. And I suppose that you have conceived an admiration for him. Well, I will be telling you about the perception of Newman by someone who did not admire him, who believed that Newman's influence on English Catholicism was almost wholly detrimental. Now, there was a time in the Church's history when we would have tried to paper over the disagreement between two great contemporary churchmen. We would have talked about personality differences or differences in perspective, anything to avoid the conclusion that two important church leaders had differed over substantive issues. There were indeed significant differences between the personalities of Newman and Manning that can explain, as we shall see, some of the conflict between them. And the disparity in the offices they occupied within the church in England, one arguably the most important Catholic theologian and the greatest writer of English prose in the 19th century, the other an activist archbishop and a political actor of consummate skill, this difference can account, again, for some of their different perceptions of the Church's needs and wants. But I shall presume that we are all now grown up enough as Catholics to face the possibility of real substantive disagreement between church leaders about authority in the Church and the mission of the Church in the world. God knows we should be used enough to such disagreement by now. John Henry Newman was beatified by Pope Benedict XVI in 2010, declared a blessed, and will probably be made a saint. The same is unlikely to happen to Henry Edward Manning. It would be a mistake, however, to allow the beauty and the attractiveness of Newman's personality or the uncongeniality of Manning's to stand in the way of an effort to understand and evaluate their disagreements over the direction of the Church in their day. Saints are not always the best leaders, and powerful leaders who manifest little tolerance for opposition are not always wrong. Similarly, Newman is popularly thought to have been vindicated by the Second Vatican Council, whose father he is often acclaimed to be. Manning's paternity with regard to Vatican I, where he earned from his enemies the sobriquet Il Diablo del Concilio, the devil of the council, earns him little admiration today. You can consult Father John O'Malley's book on Vatican I for an assessment of that role. And yet, the concerns and debates in the Church of our day are not perhaps the best initial guides to understanding what was at issue between Newman and Manning almost 150 years ago. There is an influential book in the field of historiography called The Past is a Foreign Country. And as a sometime history professor, I'm beginning to think that the past becomes alien after only about a generation. After 148 years since Vatican I, to understand that council, we need to make a conscious effort to recapture a world very different from our own. The controversies between Manning and Newman were not the same as the ones that we are engaged in now, but it is possible that the effort to comprehend their disagreement will help us understand how we got to where we are as Catholics today. I mentioned that it is possible to account for some, at least, of the difference between Manning and Newman on the basis of conflict of personality. Newman was not the only eminent Victorian who started out as a friend of Manning's, but with whom the Archbishop clashed later in his life. William Gladstone, the great 19th century Prime Minister, and Manning had been intimates as undergraduates at Oxford and friends for years after that. but broke off contact twice, once over Manning's conversion to Catholicism, once over Gladstone's attack on the Vatican Council. Reflecting later in his life on the inevitability of these clashes, Manning commented, "Mr. Gladstone is a substantive and likes to be attended by adjectives. And I am not exactly an adjective." This was a rare moment of self-knowledge on Manning's part, and without committing myself on Newman as a substantive, it was certainly the case that Henry Edward Manning was no adjective. Perhaps the most useful incident in illustrating the way in which personalities contributed to misunderstanding and indeed antagonism between Newman and Manning is the notorious affair of Newman's Cardinalate in 1878, and the perception that Manning had sought to deny him this honor. It is certainly not my intention nor my role as a historian to defend or condemn Manning's conduct in this affair, except perhaps to state my opinion that Manning was not guilty of deliberately trying to block the honor. Had he wished to do this, he could have achieved his purpose far more effectively and with less embarrassment to himself than the clumsy way that he handled this affair. He was, after all, the master of the well-placed word in the appropriate curial ear in Rome. Manning, who despite his talent for intrigue was no master of subtlety when it came to human relations, had several times been burnt in his dealings with Newman, precisely when he had sought to honor him. There was, for example, Manning's attempt in 1865, just after he himself had been named Archbishop of Westminster, to have Newman made a bishop, a move he undertook at the urging of one who ought to have known Newman's own mind, his own bishop, W.B. Ullathorne, the Bishop of Birmingham. Manning made this attempt for no sinister motive that I have been able to discover, yet Newman took the offer as an attempt to kick him upstairs and so muzzle him, and in a rather ungracious letter to Manning on the occasion of an invitation to the latter's consecration, laid down as the condition of his attendance that the offer should not be renewed. This was only one of a number of instances in which Manning had extended invitations to Newman that he thought would be gratifying to him, only to be rebuffed in terms that gave Manning to understand that in so doing he had misread Newman's probable reaction and been heedless of his sensibilities. There is no question that Newman distrusted Manning's motives toward him. On the occasion of an effort by Manning in 1867 to heal the rift between them that had arisen over whether or not Newman would be permitted to establish a house of the oratory of St. Philip Neri, the religious congregation to which Newman belonged at Oxford, in order to minister to Catholic undergraduates there, Newman let Manning know as much. I'm quoting. "You must kindly bear with me," Newman wrote, "although I seem rude to you, while I give you the real interpretation of my feeling toward you. I say frankly then, and as a duty to friendship, that it is a distressing mistrust, which now for 4 years past I have been unable to dismiss from my mind, and which is but my own share of a general feeling, though men are slow to express it, especially your immediate friends, that you are difficult to understand. I wish I could get myself to believe that the fault was my own, and that your words, your bearing, and your implications ought, though they have not, served to prepare me for your acts." That was plain speaking indeed from Father Newman to the Archbishop of Westminster, nor did anything in the subsequent history of their relationship modify either Newman's distrust or Manning's awareness that he was mistrusted. It is against this background that we return to Manning's role in the affair of the Cardinalate. Manning had offered no resistance at all to the proposal by a group of Catholic noblemen led by the Duke of Norfolk to suggest to the new Pope, Leo XIII, that Newman be honored with a red hat. In fact, Manning had drafted the letter to the Papal Secretary of State and conveyed to Ullathorne the news of the Pope's approval. The response Manning received to this was a letter from Newman to Ullathorne, in which Newman expressed his gratitude for the Pope's gesture, which he considered altogether above me, and an entreaty that the Pope would consider the diffidence of his mind, his health, his age, the retired course of his life, his ignorance of foreign languages, and his lack of experience in business to, and I quote, "to let me die where I have so long lived." The expectation, by the way, of a cardinal who was not a diocesan bishop was that he would live in Rome. "Since I know now and henceforth that His Holiness thinks kindly of me," Newman concluded, "what more can I desire?" In this letter, there is no indication of Newman's wish to accept the honor, and indeed the tenor is such that an honest person might fairly conclude that Newman wished not to be made to accept it. Accompanying Newman's letter was a letter to Manning from Ullathorne, expressing Ullathorne's belief that Newman would indeed accept the cardinalate if exempted from the residency requirement. At this point, Manning, who was about himself to set out for Rome, sent the letter of Newman on ahead to Rome and carried Ullathorne's letter along with him. At the same time, there was what we would call a press leak, either from Manning himself or from someone in his entourage, that Newman had declined the honor, which indeed Manning believed he had. The publication of this leak set wheels in motion, with Newman writing to Norfolk, Norfolk to Manning, and Ullathorne to the Secretary of State, all stating that Newman would accept the cardinalate. As soon as Manning arrived in Rome and received the Duke's letter, he went directly to the Pope and set matters right. Immediately, the Pope made his decision to create Newman a cardinal, exempting him from the residential requirement. Manning both telegraphed and wrote the news to Ullathorne for communication to Newman. These are the bare facts of the affair, upon which I would like to offer a few observations. One can only speculate why Manning initially sent Ole Newman's ambiguous letter ahead to Rome while carrying Ullathorne's gloss along with him. There is no explanation from Manning himself on this question. My own theory is that Manning, remembering the imbroglio over the bishopric in 1865, when he had been ill-served by accepting Ullathorne's interpretation of what Newman wished, and aware of Newman's previous refusal to accept honors, and certainly conscious of the distrust he knew Newman felt for him, decided to let Roman authorities make what they would of Newman's ambiguities without any other gloss, either from Ullathorne or from himself. A more puzzling question is how Manning himself, in light of his own poor record in interpreting Newman's mind, could so quickly have come to the conclusion that Newman declined the honor and allowed this to become public. Here, the issue of personality enters in, for Manning was simply not the man to abide in suspended judgment on any question, to entertain doubts once he had decided a question, nor to keep his beliefs to himself. The best explanation I have come across of how Manning's mind must have worked in this affair is from Manning's most recent biographer, Robert Gray, who is on the whole quite well disposed to his subject. And I quote Gray here, "The key to Manning's conduct in this instance lies in his infinite capacity for self-illusion. Newman's equivocating letter gave him grounds for believing what he wanted to believe, that Newman had refused, and thereafter Newman's refusal was Manning's version of reality. Ullathorne's covering letter could be discountenanced because Manning never permitted extraneous facts to interfere with his fundamental beliefs." The only other comment I feel needs to be made, admittedly from the perspective of an age and a culture that has different tastes in these matters, is that none of this trouble would have arisen if Newman had been straightforward and less delicate in accepting what, in fact, he really wanted. But now we are dealing with Newman's personality. If Manning misinterpreted him, it was because there was nothing in Manning's makeup that enabled him to comprehend such diffidence. Besides differing perspectives, I mentioned different perspectives as another way of coming to terms with the disagreement between these two great Victorian churchmen over the needs and wants of the church in their day. Here, the best illustration I know of what I mean by different perspectives involves an attempt on Manning's part to enlist Newman's support for temperance reform. It became one of Manning's deepest convictions after he became head of the Catholic Church in England that the most serious problem faced by the great majority of Catholics in England, who were by this time poor Irish and urban slums, was drunkenness and its devastating effects on family life. Now, we may find this simplistic as a diagnosis of social ills, but in an age before a more profound social analysis, most friends of the working class would have agreed with Manning. Manning was therefore a supporter of the Protestant United Kingdom Alliance, of Father Matthew's temperance campaign in Ireland, predecessor of the Pioneers, and he started his own Catholic temperance organization in England, the League of the Cross. One of the objects of temperance organizations in England was to pass a licensing bill, which embodied what was called local option, giving communities the right to control, or if they desired, to suppress public houses. When Manning, as one of those principally involved in public agitation for this legislation, wrote to enlist Newman's support for the campaign, Newman declined, replying, "As for me, I do not know whether we have too many public houses or not enough." Manning's reaction to this reply is not recorded, probably a good thing, but it would not have been hard to guess. Newman may have wanted to make a point about not depriving the poor of the means to drown their sorrows, but that a Catholic priest who lived in one of the great industrial cities of England with a significant population of Irish poor would seem indifferent to or flippant about what Manning considered the greatest social evil of the day must have been deeply shocking to him. This little incident illustrates a difference between Manning and Newman, of which Newman himself seems to be aware, at least in his own regard. Newman was not a political person, at least so far as great public issues were concerned. In a letter to his own bishop, William Ullathorne, he once said, "I have been indoors all of my life, while you have battled for the church in the world." Had he and Manning been in any way copacetic, he might have realized the same thing about the Archbishop of Westminster, who even more than Ullathorne spent his life in the welter of national politics. Newman's lack of interest in public affairs and Manning's absorption in them were, of course, consequences of the different offices they occupied in the church, which were, in turn, a function of different talents and ambitions. Newman's interests, as he stated, were intramural, mainly intellectual, although he was not without his own skill in organizing political parties within the church. Of Manning, it had been said before he entered the ministry of the established church that he might have been Prime Minister of England. Their different positions gave Newman and Manning very different perceptions of the same church to which both belonged, and it would be hard to overemphasize the importance of this difference of perspective in explaining some of the more notable contentions between them. For Manning, when he assumed the Archbishopric of Westminster in 1865, the Catholic Church in England was above all the 1 million or so Catholics of Irish birth or descent who had flooded into the English cities, especially in the years after the famine. This number contrasted with perhaps 150,000 English or Old Catholics, as they sometimes were called, descendants of the recusants, among them some quite wealthy noblemen like the Duke of Norfolk, and a minuscule number of converts like Manning and Newman themselves. The needs of the Irish, who were thus the vast majority of the Catholic population in England, are not hard for us to imagine. They were not unlike the needs of the Irish who came to the United States in the same period, only affected by the more advanced urban and industrial character of late 19th century England. They needed churches and schools, presbyteries and convents, orphanages and refuges for unwed mothers, and chaplains for the prisons, reformatories, and armed forces where the Irish were overrepresented and underserved. All of this in a context of desperate poverty, appalling living conditions, indifference of the government to their claims, and the hostility of the great majority of the populace to their religion. Most of Manning's long reign as Archbishop of Westminster and head of the Roman Catholic Church in England was spent in building up the infrastructure of church life, finding money to pay for it, pressing on the government the claims for fair treatment for his mostly poor and despised flock. As here in the United States, education was the greatest concern of church leadership in England, and it was in matters relating to education that Newman and Manning had one of their most serious disagreements. Given the socioeconomic conditions of the great majority of Catholics in London and England, it is not hard to predict that Manning's interest in education would focus on the primary and secondary level. Here we can only note in passing that Manning played a decisive role in negotiating with government for the passage of a series of education acts that eventuated in a rate-aided dual system of elementary education. The chief beneficiaries of this system were the children of the Catholic Irish poor, who would now be educated in England in Catholic schools. At the level of secondary education, where voluntary efforts were more necessary, Manning found himself in frequent conflict over the priorities of the Church for education with the Old Catholics, who were, of course, the Church's main source of voluntary contributions. The great desire of the Old Catholics in regard to secondary education was the establishment and support of Catholic equivalents of the ancient public schools, of which a number, like the Jesuits Stonyhurst, the Benedictines Ampleforth and Downside, and Newman's own oratory school in Birmingham, had existed before Manning became Archbishop. These schools offered a classical education, similar to that which, in the English public schools, prepared young men for matriculation at Oxford and Cambridge, an issue we will come to in a moment. Manning's priorities in regard to secondary education were very different. He recognized the need, above all, for a scientific, commercial education for the benefit of the just beginning to emerge Catholic middle classes. Conflicting priorities came to a head in Manning's own diocese when the Jesuits, with strong financial backing from old Catholic families, attempted to open an upper-class grammar school at the same time that Manning was trying to raise funds for a middle-class school. Manning blocked them, with the result of much ill feeling on the part of the Old Catholics and, of course, the closing of their purses against the Archbishop's projects. If Manning's great concern in education was primary and secondary training for the majority of the poor and middle-class Catholics, Newman's, as you will know, was the intellectual culture of Catholics at the level of university studies. The beneficiaries of this concern, given the composition of the Catholic community and the economic realities of higher education in that day, could only be a small number of the sons of the wealthy among the English Old Catholics and converts. It was this concern of Newman's for higher education that led him in 1851 into the ill-fated project of the Catholic University in Dublin and gave us along the way the masterpiece of the idea of a university. Manning, only just recently a convert himself, was certainly well disposed toward this project and attempted to assist Newman in recruiting professors, although he declined Newman's invitation to become vice-rector because Cardinal Wiseman, the first Archbishop of Westminster, had advised him as a new convert to spend some time in Rome. It's interesting to note that while he was in Dublin, Newman strongly lobbied the English bishops not to permit Roman Catholics to attend Oxford and Cambridge, which had only recently dropped their exclusive tests, lest such permission injure the Catholic University in Dublin. The failure of the Catholic University, partly due to lack of support on the part of the Irish bishops, partly due to the reluctance of well-off Catholics on both sides of the Irish Sea to send their sons, led to Newman's withdrawal in 1858. But with the demise of the university in Dublin, the question of higher education for Catholics in the British Isles remained unsolved. Manning, in 1863, 2 years before his elevation as Archbishop, issued a call for re-examining the possibility of a Catholic university in England this time on a broader base, while Newman, reflecting on his Dublin experience, was slowly coming to the conclusion that nothing but a Catholic college at one of the ancient universities would answer the problem of providing university education for Catholics. In this conclusion, he was certainly influenced by his extensive contacts in the old Catholic community, where the sentiment for sending their sons to Oxford and Cambridge for social as well as educational reasons was growing strong. It's my own opinion that in the 1860s, the choice between the alternatives of a Catholic university and a Catholic hall at Oxford was a foregone conclusion. Both Rome and the English bishops were consistently opposed to mixed education, that is to say, educating Catholics and Protestants together, or even worse, in a clearly Protestant environment like Oxford and Cambridge. And the great mystery to me is why Newman never seemed to grasp this. In their spring meeting of 1864, and again, this is before Manning's elevation, the English bishops both condemned the idea of a Catholic college at Oxford or Cambridge and said that Catholic parents should be discouraged by all means from sending their sons there. And yet that fall, Newman bought 5 acres for an oratory in Oxford in the private hope of establishing a college there, and with the announced intention of ministering to Catholic undergraduates. At their next meeting in December, the bishops once again condemned both college and attendance and applied to Rome for the ratification of their decision. When Newman realized the strength of the bishops' opposition, he sold the property. Why Newman should have imagined that prospects for a Catholic presence at Oxford would improve after Manning's elevation in 1865 is part of the mystery. And yet in 1866, Newman once again bought property in Oxford and requested permission to establish an oratory there, telling his bishop, Bishop Ullathorne, that authorities in Rome should clearly apprehend that I feel no calling to go to Oxford except it be in order to take care of Catholic undergraduates or to convert graduates. Authorities in Rome were certainly made to apprehend this with help from Manning. And when permission was given from Rome to establish a house of the oratory at Oxford, it was on the condition that Catholics should not be attracted to the university, and with a private instruction to Ullathorne that to ensure this, Newman himself was not to go. In 1867, the Holy See affirmed the prohibition of Catholics going to Oxford, but this time instructed the bishops to provide alternative higher education for Catholics. By 1873, somewhat delayed because of the Vatican Council, the bishops adopted a proposal of Archbishop Manning's to establish a freestanding Catholic university college in England. Newman's cooperation in this venture was personally solicited by Manning, but it will not surprise you to learn that Newman declined. The Catholic University College opened in Kensington in Manning's Archdiocese in October 1874. It had a promising beginning, especially in light of the distinguished, almost exclusively lay faculty that Manning was able to attract to it. One of the interesting distinctions about the place was the emphasis given to science over classical studies, a function of Manning's own educational priorities and sense of what was to be, and his sense of what was to be most useful to the Catholic population as a whole. But like the university in Dublin, Kensington never caught on with the old Catholics as a place to send either their sons or their money. And it closed after only 4 years. That neither Newman nor the Jesuits would have anything to do with the University College is understandable in the circumstances. But their refusal did not aid its survival, nor diminish Manning's feeling that Newman, the Jesuits, and the old Catholics had cooperated in frustrating his efforts to provide higher education for the Catholic community in England. Personality and perspective can, as I have said, account for some of the difference between church leaders like Newman and Manning, and I've tried to offer some illustrations of how their differences arose from such causes. But there is no avoiding the conclusion that there were also deep and conscious disagreements between these two men about significant issues regarding authority in the church and the mission of the church in the world. These disagreements came to a head over the issue of papal infallibility. I will not presume to lecture you on Newman's vision of authority in the church. Suffice it to say that that vision is rich, complex, and deeply appealing to Catholics today. The operation of authority in the church, according to Newman, involved not only the hierarchy, the Pope and the bishops, but also what Newman called the schools, or the studium, that is to say, theologians, and also the laity, whose recognition and acceptance of Christian doctrine was an important part of its authoritative character. I would venture to say that Newman's interest in authority, like so many of his interests, was intramural. That is to say, it concerned the authentic development of Christian doctrine within the church for the church's life of holiness. Obviously, from what I have been just saying, you can tell how very influential Newman's ideas on authority have been on thinking in the church today. But I also ask you to note what in this context I have only been able to assert, that for Newman, authority functioned within the Christian community for the community of the church. Manning's view of authority in the church was, from our point of view, you can choose your terms, traditional and classical, or reactionary and authoritarian. It was certainly firmly institutional, rigidly hierarchical, and highly centralized. Often, this position is described as ultramontane, looking over the mountains to Rome and the Pope as the source of authority in the church. But here, and again, you will have to take my word for what otherwise would require a long and somewhat complex argument that I've made elsewhere, Manning's view of authority was outward-looking. That is to say, the operation of authority for Manning was for the sake of the church's encounter with the world, what in contemporary language, church language, I think we would call the social mission of the church in the world. Now, the world could be at times a very hostile place for the church, as indeed Manning believed it was in the 19th century, where the church would need to stand firm and sometimes suffer for what it believed. On the other hand, the world was also where the church realized its mission through social action. Manning thought that there were many encouraging developments in 19th century Britain that facilitated this mission, like the growing religious neutrality of the state, the emergence of public opinion, and the rise of mass democratic politics. And there were few ecclesiastical politicians who showed themselves with more talent for exploiting these developments than Manning. In either case, however, whether in persecution or in social and political activism, the church needed unity and a firm sense of direction. It was the role of authority, Manning believed, to provide this unity and direction. Now, although I have oversimplified the positions of Newman and Manning on authority in the church, I hope I have not misrepresented them. The very first conflict that marred what up until then had been an amicable relationship between the two occurred in 1861 over an issue of authority in the church. Not infallibility, but the temporal power. The temporal power of the Pope was, you will recall, the Church's government of the Papal States in central Italy. The Pope's control of these domains was being gradually eroded in the process of Italian unification between 1848 and 1870, when Pius IX lost the city of Rome itself and withdrew to become the prisoner of the Vatican. Most Catholics, Manning included, considered the seizure of the Papal States to be an act of sacrilege perpetrated by enemies of the Church. Manning had been one of the most articulate defenders of the temporal power, arguing that these states were essential for the freedom of the Church to carry out its mission in the world. The temporal power was necessary, he maintained, for the independent, unimpeded action of papal authority, not just within the Church, but especially in areas of public life and international affairs where the Church must be involved. Newman's very different understanding of the purpose of authority in the Church led him to the conclusion that the Church was better off without the Papal States. The purpose of authority for Newman, as we have said, was to build up the life of faith within the Church through a process of what today we might call discernment and consultation. The strong, centralized authority and unquestioning obedience that was demanded by the existence of the temporal power and the role to which it committed the papacy in public and in international life seemed to Newman a real distraction from this task. Of course, from Manning's point of view, Newman's indifference to the temporal power placed him alongside those who were the Church's declared enemies. It requires only a small leap of understanding from what they believed about the temporal power to see why Newman and Manning came down on such different sides of the infallibility debate. Manning, together with so many other ultramontane Catholics, believed that the Church was under serious threat from its enemies in the 19th century. Both conservative nationalists and radical revolutionaries wished to eliminate the Church's independent role in public and international life and either crush it or reduce it to a tame creature of the state. Against these threats, Manning believed it was imperative that the Church act and speak with a single voice. Infallibility, which was only a part and probably not the most important part of the consolidation of papal authority over the Church carried out at the First Vatican Council, was, in the first instance, a response to this perceived threat. It would be a mistake, however, to think that the ultramontane program was only defensive or reactionary. I have mentioned the fact that Manning found some developments in 19th century Britain, like the authentic religious neutrality of the state and the emergence of public opinion and mass democratic politics, to be very advantageous to the Church's mission in the world, more advantageous, in fact, than its official relationship with so-called Catholic states by means of concordats, which often restricted the Church's freedom of movement. But social action in the sometimes dangerous, sometimes promising environment of the new secular democratic world order required a high degree of discipline and unity on the part of Catholics, or so Manning believed. It was therefore most appropriate that the Church take the occasion of the Council to define infallibility and to strengthen the Pope's normal authority over the Church. Newman did not dispute the truth of papal infallibility. He always insisted that as a private individual he believed it, but he did think the definition at the time was inopportune. In his famous letter of January 1870 to Bishop Ullathorne at the Council, which also somehow was leaked to the press, Newman stated this opinion. It was only, he said, when some great evil or heresy impended that the Church was justified in defining a doctrine and binding the faithful to believe. But, and I quote him here, no impending danger is to be averted. What have we done, Newman asked, to be treated as the faithful never were treated before? When has the definition of a doctrine de fide been a luxury of devotion and not a stern and painful necessity? Why should an aggressive and insolent faction, he meant Manning and the other ultramontanes, be allowed to make the hearts of the just to mourn, whom the Lord hath not made sorrowful? Of course, it was precisely Manning's conviction that great evil and danger did impend, and that the definition was indeed a stern and painful necessity. You would think that Manning and Newman lived in different churches, as in a sense they did, that they should see things so very differently. Only one who lived, as Newman admitted he had, very much indoors all my life, could imagine that the church in 1870 was at rest and unthreatened, whereas Manning, who battled for the church and the world, perceived a necessity that escaped Newman. I said at the beginning of this talk that the effort to comprehend the disagreement between Manning and Newman on its own terms might still help us to understand how we got to where we are as Catholics today. Obviously, Newman and Manning can stand for different ways that we see the church today. Newman was fearful that an undue emphasis on the authority of the Pope would imbalance the delicate relations that existed in the church between Pope and bishops, hierarchy and faithful, magisterium and theologians. He was concerned, we would say today, about subsidiarity and collegiality, freedom of thought within the church, and the role of the laity. Given the history of the church in the century between Vatican I and Vatican II, and even afterwards, many would say his fears were well-grounded. Manning, on the other hand, was most concerned about how the church would carry out its mission in the world. He was, we would say today, concerned about issues of evangelization, of social justice, even of the liberation of peoples from oppressive structures of 19th century state and society. Manning was, like our late Pope, St. John Paul II, convinced that internal cohesion was necessary for the church to be an effective witness to Christian values against the statism and materialism, communist or capitalist, that were the false gods of his day as they still are for ours. Today, we live in either or both of the churches for which Newman and Manning can stand as symbols. I'm not sure we have succeeded any better than they have in resolving the tensions between them, but with that statement, I find that I have left the province of the historian for that of the theologian, and so any right I have to lecture to you on the basis of my own competence. Thank you. Yes, Jordan. Oh, sorry, microphone. Right.
Just wondering if you had anything to say about were they involved at all with controversy over Anglican orders that was in the 1890s, and did they have different positions on that, or had they died by that point?
Sure. No, neither of them were actively involved in that. It was really Manning's successor, Cardinal Vaughan, who was actively involved in. I imagine that certainly Manning would have had an opinion about the matter. Newman's would have been more nuanced, I think, but I don't recall that either of them ever pronounced on that particular issue.
Father, we were just talking here and wondering, with respect to Manning's view of the church versus the world, and it being antagonistic to the church, is it true, first of all, and if it's true, is it relevant that Manning left the Anglicans because there was an incursion by the English courts into the Anglican process of ordaining priests?
It was over the issue of baptismal regeneration. And yes, the civil courts interfered in a judgment by an Anglican bishop that a priest who did not believe in baptismal regeneration should not be ordained. And the court ordered, not ordained, installed in office. And the courts ruled against the bishop, and that was kind of the last straw for Manning in terms of state interference with the church. So that's one of the reasons that he was so firm on the idea that authority within the church had to be the church's authority, and it had to stand. But on the other hand, he was very open to collaboration with political structures and political parties. And the talk I'll give in the second semester will be called Engaging the Liberal State, Cardinal Manning and Irish Home Rule. So he was very involved in the home rule issue. Yeah. I expected more vehement objection to things I was saying about Newman. Come on, guys.
Hi there. I'm John Yaney. I'm a Paulist. And one of our works as community is to deal with the secular university. And we are, therefore, great champions of Newman. And Isaac Hecker and Newman, I believe anyway, have one great common characteristic, and that is that their awareness of the Spirit as following the importance of how a Catholic lives their lives in the moment and in the Spirit of God. Now, was Manning any part of that kind of? He wrote a beautiful prayer about it, but.
Certainly he was a strong advocate of university education, which he did not think could simply be reduced to, to a catechetical kind of teaching. I mean, the university that he founded, as I mentioned, was distinctive for its emphasis on science and technology. And again, partly that was a very practical decision on his part, that that's what the Catholic population of England needed, was that kind of education. And again, most of the faculty were lay people, not clerics. I suspect that there was something like a campus ministry at the Catholic University in Kensington. I don't think that there were any residential facilities, or very few. It was mostly what we would think of as a commuter school, because of course it was located right in the middle of London. So I'm not sure I've answered your question at all, but of course one of the interesting things is what Newman would think about the ways in which his own name and legacy has been adopted in a number of different quarters. And I think it's an interesting question. What would Newman think about Newman Centers? What would Newman think about the Newman Society? So these are all good questions, right?
Thank you for your presentation. What was the reaction to the public, all this, the priests in the parish, the religious orders, the disagreement between these two people?
Well, certainly I think the Irish population, the Irish poor population, thought of Manning as their protector, that Manning had their back. I haven't even talked about the ways in which he supported the labor movement in the latter part of the 19th century, especially his mediating the great dock strike right before he died, actually. And when Manning died, he got one of the biggest public displays of enthusiastic salute from the population that anybody had had. The parade for his funeral was thousands and tens of thousands of people, and again, a lot of working class people.
I wonder if latter-day ecclesiologists like Avery Dulles or others have more taken up strands of argument of Newman or Manning, or gone in a totally different direction.
Well, I think mostly Newman, but I think the important thing to realize about Manning is that this whole argument about for the church to engage in political action and social action, there has to be some kind of a sense of what the church stands for. So the articulation of the social mission of the church, I think, is an effort to come to some kind of a consensus about where the church should stand on some of these issues, and adopt a common policy on important social issues. And I think that's what Manning was trying to get at. Now, he thought that the way that happened was when you had strong authority in Rome and the strong authority of the bishops, and that's where the leadership had to come from. But you can't have a policy of social action in the church unless there's some way to come together into some kind of a consensus about what that policy should be.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm not sure if this question is off point, but the subject of education, sort of the claims about the importance of primary and secondary education versus university education. I was just wondering, what was Manning's relationship to women, particularly women religious, and perhaps more specifically, the education of girls at the primary and the secondary level in this period?
Yep.
Or does that only come later?
No. It's a very important and relevant question. But yes, in the area of primary education and to some extent secondary education, Manning encouraged and welcomed congregations of women religious into his diocese and whatever influence he had outside of it to encourage the same thing. And again, this was primarily again, in the interests of elementary education for the urban Irish poor. Yeah. I mean, university education, which Newman cared about, was not something that they were not ready yet to think about women and the problem of women in higher education. This was all the sons of the old Catholics.
I hope this question isn't too trivial, but I was wondering, for Newman, the beau ideal or approximate model of what it's all about was Philip Neri. Was there a counterpart on the part of Manning?
Charles Borromeo.
Aha.
So
It says a lot,
Newman,
doesn't it?
Manning founded and was the provost of a group called the Oblates of St. Charles. And you can understand what that would be, right? He would have this tremendous admiration for a bishop. And Manning was always very strong on the dignity of the diocesan clergy versus, for example, the religious. And, because the Jesuits, the Benedictines, and the Dominicans, and he didn't get on. And so he much preferred diocesan clergy. And so the Oblates of St. Charles were somewhat like the Oratorians, an organization of diocesan priests. And yes, he supported them and continued to support them through his life.
So I have another question about education. Is this microphone working? Okay. You can tell that members of the audience are enjoying getting educated by you from our questions. So in the 1870s and 80s, and the 80s is maybe a little late for what you're talking about, there were all these evening courses, extramural kind of courses that were growing up for working men and for
Mechanics
women.
Institutes. The Mechanics Institutes.
Mechanics Institutes,
Yeah.
exactly. Was there any kind of thought or energy put into adult education
Yes.
by Manning and people
Yes.
around London
Yeah.
and England? Can you
Yeah.
tell us about that?
Yes, that's exactly right. Manning was very interested in the Catholic equivalent of Mechanics Institutes and tried to organize them in the diocese as well for the education of Catholic working men, and to some extent women, but yes, very important issue for him.
Would they have been highly inflected by kind of religious education kind of take on it?
I don't know that much about them, but my sense is no. He was more concerned that the Catholic population received practical education and practical wisdom that was going to help them in their roles as working people and fathers of families and stuff like that. So no, they were not catechetical as much as they were, I think, practical, even technical, scientific. I think there was one over there, Jim.
Hello. I'm sorry, but I feel like I came to this event with the least amount of pre-knowledge of these two people in the room. But I thought you said earlier that Newman was considered somewhat of a architect for the pattern of Vatican II. Was that correct? And yet everything I hear you say about Manning indicates that he had a far greater sense of social justice as we feel we do have now from result of Vatican II. So what are the differences there that you point to?
Again, I think that is the case, and I think it's a reflection, again, of Newman's focus on the internal life of the church. Newman left the Anglican Church because he was convinced that the evangelicals were not leading people into holiness of life. And that's why he left the church. So that always continued to be a really important focus. Manning, as we just heard, left the Anglican Church because he was concerned about the state impinging on the autonomy of the church as an actor in the world and in human history. So I think that's partly where the clash and difference comes from.
In view of his devotion to Charles Borromeo, and yet his own experience in formation in the Anglican tradition, what was his track record in the seminary education and the formation of diocesan clergy?
I don't know a lot about that in particular, Jim, but again, I would say that he was such a strong advocate for the diocesan clergy, for the dignity of the diocesan clergy. There are times when he argues about people still were concerned about who was more perfect, the religious or the diocesan clergy and stuff like that. And he has some very compelling arguments that the diocesan clergy were really realizing the goals that Christ had for priests in the world more so than the religious.
Is a place like Allen Hall, for example, founded after his time?
I really am not sure that I know the answer to that.
Yes, Father, I was intrigued by the references that I have recently read of some of the influences of both Manning and Newman on American Protestant theology. I understand that the German theologian Philip Scharf, who was on his way to America, stopped off in London to confer and talk both with Manning and with Newman, and then went on to the Mercersburg Seminary in Pennsylvania, and he, along with the Reverend Dr. John Williamson Nevin, developed the Mercersburg theology, which was a more altered, Christ-centered theology as opposed to a sermon-based theology. I was wondering if you had any comments on that.
I have to say I don't know anything about that. I'm really interested to hear it, and I'd love to know more. So maybe you can communicate that with me at some point. Please do. Yeah. Okay, any last shots? Sure.
About 100 years ago, actually, in the 1860s, there was a clergyman in Cambridge who believed very, very, very strongly in public education and was on the Cambridge school board. And it was Father Charles, or I can't remember his first name, Scully. And he was on the Cambridge school board as a public official and a pastor. At the same time, he founded a girls' school, a boys' school, a high school, and a junior college in his parish. That's a very different reaction to public education. And I was wondering what these guys would say over the controversy with Father Drinan, who here was a priest in the public government. And here's Father Scully, actively a politician, working for public education and founding Catholic education.
I mentioned briefly that Cardinal Manning was very involved in the passage of an Education Act in 1870 that was subsequently amended a couple of times and reached its conclusion in 1906. But part of the Education Act of 1870 established school boards in localities, and those boards had a degree of control over both Catholic and secular education, and just the way it worked itself out, because it was a dual system. But he encouraged Catholic clergy and laity to join these school boards, these local school boards, which were local governmental agencies, and he thought it was important that they do that. I'm not at all aware of what position, if any, Newman would have taken about public education. Okay. Great. I will leave you with one quote. I have to offer this quote. So, Newman was not the only person who didn't like Cardinal Manning. A number of the bishops of the other dioceses in the province of Westminster didn't like him. And there's a famous quote from Bishop Bagshaw, who once said that the greatest tragedy ever to befall the Catholic Church in Great Britain was the death of Mrs. Manning. He was married. As an Anglican clergyman, he was married, and his wife died young. They were childless, but